Whistle a blow, and now I know that we're going. We've just started. Yes, we've departed. Why, we're leaving the pier. I say we're steaming from New York Bay. That's why I feel so gay. If we get there on time, I'll be mighty happy. If we're not there on time, why, I'll feel mighty bad, 'cause we'll sure have some time. Way down in Louisiana, here's what makes them all feel glad.
Pop culture has been in love with the idea of the Italian mafia from The Sopranos to The Godfather. The title Mafia inspires thoughts of Armani suits, a code of respect, tales of the difficulty of immigration into the United States, and unnecessarily loud trumpet music. But does the listener know that even the word mafia began not in the streets of Sicily, not in New York or Chicago, but in New Orleans? That's right. The Italian mafia began in the Big Easy and flooded into Vegas, New York, New Jersey, and Chicago, among other places. Long before this, organizations like the Black Hand also originated in New Orleans that ended up setting off a catalyst creating the First World War across seas. The immigration experience into the United States was not an easy one for many. Among European settlers, the Irish, Italians, and the Jewish were seen as second-class citizens who were often denied jobs, denied entry into homes and apartments, and even had their murders and targeted attacks by xenophobic people go unrecognized, undocumented, and uninvestigated. This left these immigrants with fewer options in life at that time. Most secluded themselves into major cities like New Orleans and New York, into neighborhoods by their communities and for their communities. Others, who knew the deck was stacked against them, turned to crime to provide for their families or make a name for themselves. But what's good for the goose isn't necessarily good for the gander. Often, because some individuals in these nationalities would turn to crime, anyone within that community would often be thrown under the bus and perceived as criminals by default. This would often lead to targeted attacks, further discrimination, and even prejudice-based mass killings. These attacks and discrimination would often encourage a new generation to be distrustful of society, law enforcement, and burrow deeper into their communities and identities, perpetuating and evolving the cycle over time. Thus, the origins of the Italian and Irish experience in America, and why they have their own mafias and distinct subgroups in the United States, even to this day. Today on Crescent Crime, we will talk about the Italian experience in New Orleans and how the Mafia, the Black Hand, and one of the bloodiest targeted attacks in post-Civil War United States history, all in what we call the Big Easy. Welcome, Mr. Lamar White Jr.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Mafia in New Orleans and how the title Mafia started?
So the history of the Mafia in New Orleans is allegedly the cradle of the American Mafia. It's also one of the cities, one of the main ports of entry in the United States for many years. When Sicily, there's the mass exodus from Sicily in the turn of the last century, New Orleans received a lot of Italian immigrants, and unlike most cities, where the balance was about 80% continental Italians, 20% Sicilians, in New Orleans, it was more like 95% Sicilians, 5% continental Italians. So New Orleans was one of the most, it was, this outlier in that respect. And there was a vibrant Sicilian community here. People disagree. There's significant disagreement about when the quote-unquote mafia arrived in New Orleans. The word mafia didn't even really appear in relation to organized crime until the mid-1800s, 1860 or so in Italy. And that was an opera. That's sort of the first mention of this word in association with organized crime. Obviously, just because it hadn't been given a name yet, doesn't mean the organization didn't already exist. But there's some disagreement about whether or not the people that arrived early on in New Orleans who were Italian or Sicilian criminals were just bandits or petty thieves, or if they belonged to some larger organization. I tend to think that the Mafia, let's just put it this way, the first person that was identified as having been associated with the Palermo Mafia in the United States was a guy named Giuseppe Esposito, and he was arrested in New Orleans in 1881. So just for simplicity's sake, other people say there was another, Agnello family was here before. I think that it's best to begin the story with Esposito.
Interesting. So Was the organization of the Black Hand associated with the Mafia directly? Was it a different group that just happened to also be occupied by this group? How did that come along?
It was similar and different, maybe overlapping. I mean, I think that Black Hand was less of an organization than the Mafia. The Mafia, I compare it in my book to the Benedictine monks. I mean, this is a sort of sect with its own rites and rituals and codes of conduct and traditions that are passed along from one generation to another, and that really you should consider it to be more like an institution than a gang. So there were people who may have called themselves members of the mafia, but we should make a distinction between mafia with the capital M and mafia, the common noun with the lowercase m, which we just generally refer to organized crime.
Interesting. So can you tell me a little bit about how the Black Hand got started necessarily, and then how it spread to Europe?
Well, there's this idea of I can tell you about New Orleans and when it first sort of appeared here and what it meant. It's just the idea of vendetta killings, and the Padrone system of where there's one person in a neighborhood that you pay tribute to, and they're supposed to protect you against authorities. Now, this was in Sicily. Of course, Sicily was somewhat ungovernable for many years, hundreds of years, switched hands over and over again. So this was a system that sort of was developed in Sicily that protected local native Sicilians from their foreign occupiers, if you will. When it was exported to the United States, it became a just sort of a way for some, a crime boss to control a certain area of town. There's evidence of Black Hand activity here in the mid 1800s, but a lot of this it's just important to underscore how much of this was exaggerated and embellished by the media at the time, and then subsequently by generations of folklorists and tabloid writers and sort of fabulous historians or revisionist historians. I think of a book called "The Rise of the Criminal Brotherhoods" by David Chandler, who reported a lot on Carlos Marcello, and it's great. It's a fun book to read about, but about the history of these organizations like the Mafia. But it's completely spectacular, and it's kind of fantastical and not really based in fact. So.
Understood.
Yeah. And so when did the Black Hand arrive, and was the Black Hand real? I don't know. It arrived sometime in the mid 1800s. The evidence of it being these notes that were left that would threaten people, and usually in Italian. Again, New Orleans had just a high percentage of Sicilian immigrants. But really there was no. How do I say this? Proportionately, there was no. I mean, they were no more likely to commit a crime than any other group of people in the city.
Well, and sometimes they were victims of crime.
Absolutely.
And, as we saw with, correct me if I'm wrong, but the largest ethnically motivated mass killing post-Civil War did happen to the Sicilians. Several men were hanged.
This is a good way of transitioning into this. So I said earlier that for my purposes, I think that it's best to begin the story of the Mafia in New Orleans, and really in the New World in America, with the arrest and apprehension of Giuseppe Esposito in 1881. He was a member of a gang led by a guy named Antonina Leone in Sicily. They sort of like terrorized the people that live in this mountainous area south of Palermo. And they were kidnappers and robbers, and they're all independent agents, but every now and then they would like work together under this guy's Leone's gang. And famously, they kidnapped this really wealthy young British tourist in 1876, and they held him for ransom, like 5,000 pound sterling. I don't know what that would translate into today's dollars, but apparently it was a lot of money. The story is that they kept him in a cave, and they would send his wife, like his earlobe, threatened to send his nose in the mail just to extract more money from her. Also, this was, but just so you know, I mean, parts of the story again could have been embellished. Mm-hmm. Some of the storytellers claim that he was a priest. He was actually this like junior partner in his daddy's investment firm. But at any rate, it royally angered the British government, and so they demanded that he be returned, and it led to some really serious international tension. This Italian government was able to apprehend Esposito after a protracted escape and fight that was really bloody, sort of a massacre. Leon, we don't know where he went. We think he escaped to maybe North Africa. Esposito was sent to prison in Palermo. He breaks out of prison 6 months later, probably by bribing the guards and maybe with the help of the Palermo Mafia. He and about 5 or 6 others sail to New York. They spend 8 or 9 months in New York. They have a lot of money on them, by the way. This is the money that they've collected from looting and from ransoms. A very common practice at the time in Sicily were these kidnappings. And so they arrive in New York and they're very wealthy, but they don't really stick in New York. Esposito decides to come down to New Orleans. And he takes in with this very wealthy, already well-established Sicilian immigrant here in New Orleans in the French Quarter, a part of the French Quarter known colloquially as Little Palermo because it was so Sicilian. And he's very flashy with this money. This guy, he's like 36 years old, brand new to town. He shows up in really flashy clothes, and the first thing he does is he goes and buys this $25,000 boat in Madisonville, and he names it after Leon, the bandit that's like really famous that, he was the underboss for or whatever. And he flies the Sicilian flag. Anchors it in Lake Pontchartrain so everyone can see it. And this was like a sign to the community, like, guess who's here? People had known who this guy Esposito was in Sicily. It took a while for authorities in New Orleans to figure out that the rich Sicilian man who just showed up with the new boat was maybe a criminal. But he was arrested eventually. They got this notice from the Italian government that fit the man's description. Detectives watched him for several weeks. And he was arrested outside of St. Louis Cathedral on Jackson Square, that wrought iron gate. He was walking out of the wrought iron gate, and 2 cousins arrested him. A guy named Mike Hennessy and his cousin Dave Hennessy. Dave Hennessy, so, long story short, Esposito's found to be who the man the man they thought he was. He was living under an assumed name here in New Orleans. Later that year, he gets sent back to Palermo. He spends the rest of his life in jail. And 10 years later, Dave Hennessy, who was then a 23-year-old detective who'd become relatively famous for making this big arrest. This was news all over the country and really all over Europe. He's now the chief of police in New Orleans. And he's still investigating organized crime, particularly Sicilian organized crime in New Orleans, which was concentrated around the port of New Orleans. Sicilians for a long time had basically controlled the trade that took place at the port, which was at the time literally along the riverfront. Oh. And this was mainly because of the fruit industry. So the lemon groves of Sicily and the sugarcane fields of New Orleans, there was this natural connection already. Even before, New Orleans or Louisiana was a part of the United States or part of America. It existed really due to the Spanish, when New Orleans was under Spanish control. At any rate, and that's also how we have the tropical fruit industry from the Caribbean because of the Spanish occupation. That also became a hotbed of like sort of organized crime activity, if you will. I mean, it didn't have that term at the time for it, but there were these power brokers that would be in control of the labor contracts for all of the dock workers and stevedores, and these were very valuable positions where you could make lots of money. So Esposito kind of comes into this world, and he gets right up to the top of this world pretty quickly. It turns out it's because everyone's sending him food on consignment, so he doesn't actually have to spend any money to make money. And the 2 families that control the port are in conflict. I mean, this is a back and forth. There was a shooting between one of the families and the other. The chief of police then becomes, Dave Hennessy, young guy, probably 32 at the time, and he gets directly involved in this dispute between these 2 families. These sometimes are considered the original mafia families of New Orleans. And one night, on his way home, really late at night, in October of 1890, he is, I think it's raining outside. He goes to this bar with a friend of his. He has a dozen oysters and drinks a thing of milk. I don't know why anyone would drink milk with oysters, but and
Yeah,
then
not a winning combination.
and he gets out. He walks. It's in the darkness, and he's on I think Gerard Street, and there's this basically he's ambushed at his front door, and he is in agony. This guy that walked with him turned maybe 2 blocks before he got to his house, but he heard the gunfire, rushes up to him. The chief of police, Hennessy, he lives for another like 12 hours or so, and he's able to communicate with people and tell them who he thought shot him, and he uses an ethnic slur for Italians, which I will not repeat.
GM.
But this immediately, so he passes away, and it's this huge, moment of sadness really for New Orleans, because this is a guy that people had come to respect. His father also was a police officer who also died relatively young, and Hennessy had been a part of the New Orleans Police Department since he was 12.
Wow.
So the city really reacted very strongly, and there was a long period of mourning. They say that his funeral was larger than any funeral in the city since Jefferson Davis's, which is probably a good thing. And they round up basically the mayor at the time says, well, he said that Italians killed him, so I want you to go round up anyone who fits the description of, someone that looks suspicious as an Italian. So they round up like 40, 45 people, and whittle it down eventually to about 19. And they decide, because there's 19 defendants in this conspiracy to assassinate the chief of police, that they're going to try them in two separate groups. Mm-hmm. The first group goes on trial, and I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but this was the following year, in March of the following year, 1891. And the evidence is flimsy against these men for the most part. They were rounded up indiscriminately, and the investigation wasn't really clean, and it was guilt by association. And a lot of them had alibis, really strong alibis. So there were 11 of them, I believe, were tried together in the first round of trials. 3 of those defendants were found not guilty. I think one or two was a directed verdict by the judge. In other words, the judge listened to all the evidence and said, "I've already heard all this, jury. You don't have to make up your mind. This man is not guilty." The rest of the defendants were there was a mistrial declared. The jury deadlocked. At the time, even though all of these people were no longer on trial, there was another count that they had to face the next day. So they were still held overnight for basically procedural reasons. And in that time frame, a group of prominent citizens in New Orleans organized a rally to basically protest these unjust verdicts. The whole city had been convinced. Apparently, they weren't really reading about this trial, because if you had been reading about it, you'd have known the government did not put on a good case at all. But they were upset that these men were set free, or that there were mistrials. 8,000 people showed up on Canal Street and gathered around the statue of Henry Clay, which is no longer there. It's been moved. But that was the epicenter of this. And there was a part of this group that was like a well-armed mob, like a little faction of them that were well-armed, and they'd come prepared for this. And they go and storm the parish prison. And the prison guards, they don't really put up much of a fight, frankly. There's just nothing they could do, honestly. They were outnumbered. And there was a huge mob of people, They ended up killing 11 people. Murdering 11 people, I should say. Murdering, not killing.
Yeah.
I think that maybe some argue about this, but maybe only two of them, are believed to have had some connection to the crime. So really 9 completely innocent people. This is outrageous to most of the country. Well, I shouldn't say that. This is outrageous to about half of the country.
Right.
About half of the country thinks it is amazing that the city of New Orleans did this, and they praise the city for taking action in their own hands. And the other more civilized half of the country says this is, just a horrendous crime, a crime against humanity. The Italian government actually. There's almost in the minds of many people leads to a war between Italy and the United States. the United States is forced to pay Italy reparations.
Yeah.
So this was a big incident. But more importantly than that, for the purposes of our conversation, that's when the word mafia entered the American vernacular.
Interesting.
Yeah, that trial and the subsequent lynching, which people say is the largest mass lynching in American history after the Civil War.
Man, that is dark, but it just goes to show that sometimes we do create our own problems. Yeah. I'm curious, because I am not originally from New Orleans or Louisiana. Who were the main families in New Orleans?
Well, that's a good question. Well, again, it depends on who you talk to.
True.
The Madrangas and the Provenzanos were the families that competed for the shipping and the port contracting. That they were the ones that sort of back and forth had warred over control of the New Orleans port. So some people will say that it's that they'll trace back the Marcello family to the Madrangas. There are other prominent Italian names. I mean, there were so many Sicilians here. Some say it's the Agnellos that were here first. One of those people, though, it's worth noting, was killed in one of the most prominent members of the most prominent Sicilian family in New Orleans was actually killed or murdered in this parish prison incident.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So his brother ended up becoming the de facto head of what considered by some to be, probably in retrospect, labeled the head or the boss of the local mafia. $1 Million Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, when you feel like you're being backed into a corner, you're going to double down.
Yeah.
So would you estimate there were 5, 10, 12 families, or is it kind of impossible to tell because there's ambiguity as to who was in the mafia, who was
there's
not?
a lot of ambiguity about who's in the mafia and who's not. Like think about this guy Esposito. He was considered a mafiosi, but was he really? Well, in Sicily they would say, actually, he's kind of a bandit that just went around and kidnapped tourists. That's not the mafia's MO. And yeah, he may have gotten the help of the Palermo Mafia in escaping from prison, but that's only because he paid them. So this association was one that you could say was invented or manufactured by the American press. The same could be said about the crime that took place in New Orleans with the assassination of David Hennessy. That was almost certainly not a mafia-ordered hit. With mafia with the capital M. So again, this just depends on what we mean by the term. I know that years later, let's skip ahead, Carlos Marcello would say that I ain't never heard of no mafia. He would call himself a racketeer, and that was the term that he preferred, the rackets. So, and even though there's many reasons that he's was being disingenuous when he said something like that. I don't know who the mafia is. He also is telling a bit of the truth because there were no formal traditions like there were in New York or Chicago. There were no these rites and rituals. The omerta, the code of silence. It wasn't like that under the Marcello regime, and I don't think it really ever was like that in New Orleans, a city that's kind of an outlier in so many ways.
I was going to say New Orleans is usually the exception to every rule.
Yeah.
I will say, though, it seems like, especially from what you're describing, the mafia was a little more disjointed and didn't have a clear definition in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, when Americans think of the mafia, they think of very distinct families and they think of pop culture.
Right.
And I'm curious, was there an evolution and a solidification of the definition of mafia from the 18th century or from the 19th century to the 20th century?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. That's a good way of putting it. You could also say that in Louisiana it was disorganized crime and not organized crime. But yeah, there was maybe a growing evolution and development of the institution of the mafia in the United States that occurred in the early 20th century up until, let's say, the mid-1950 or so. And you see that with Appalachian, the meeting that took place in, I think, 1957 in upstate New York, where you have all of these national mafiosi leaders gathering in the same, someone's private home. They're arrested. Marcello himself, Carlos Marcello, was considered the reputed boss of this is who I'm writing a book about, of the New Orleans Mafia from about 1947 to really effectively his death in 1993, although some people say that someone else had taken over before he died. But at any rate, for either nearly 40 years or over 40 years, which is a significant amount of time, he was connected to all of these people. I think that you could also say that the growth of the mafia in New Orleans in particular took place in conjunction with the establishment of the tropical fruit trade.
Oh.
And the Sicilians that ran the port in New Orleans also became the families that founded United Fruit Company and Standard Fruit Company. New Orleans, both of which were headquartered in New Orleans, the two largest fruit companies in the world.
Well, we've mentioned the name Carlos Marcello quite a few times. So for audiences listening, can you tell me a little bit about the book you're working on, why you started working on the book, and then, of course, who is Carlos Marcello? From the very beginning, what were his origins?
Well, Carlos Marcello, like I said, was the reputed boss of the New Orleans Mafia for nearly 40 years, and is also, in my opinion, has one of the most fascinating untold stories of the 20th century, and perhaps the most fascinating untold story of organized crime. And I say untold, I know that some have told some of his story in the past. I became interested in writing a book about him about 4 years ago. I've been writing it for 3. After just doing some research on another topic that had to do with Huey P. Long and his brother Earl Long, and then realizing over time as I was digging through these archives that there was another name that came up all of the time in the press during the mid-20th century in Louisiana, and that name was Carlos Marcello. And I realized that this man was probably one of the most famous people of the 20th century in Louisiana. And obviously, I had heard his name growing up. I grew up in Alexandria, Louisiana, and he had some affiliates there. I think most people that have grown up or in my generation or a little bit older than me would probably be able to tell you that they had stories, no matter where they're from in Louisiana. They had stories about knowing people who knew people or whatever who were associated with Marcello. He's fascinating for a number of reasons. He's not a typical mob boss. For one thing, he was born in North Africa. He was born in Tunis, Tunisia, which at the time when he was born in 1910 was this it was a French protectorate, but it was like the Sicilian enclave. It was like this resort community / destination for Sicilians, and there were 80,000 people living in this little enclave where he was born in Tunis. That becomes a very important factor in his life later on when they try to deport him. But yeah, he basically grew up his entire life in Barataria Bay and in what they call the Lower Coast. So the same region that Jean Lafitte, haunted. Carlos Marcello. That was Carlos Marcello's playground growing up as a child.
Interesting.
He became involved in what I've been able to uncover is it looks like he and his father became involved in bootlegging when he was fairly young. And then there's this strange incident that happens in 1929 where a bank is robbed in Algiers, and 4 bank robbers, including the getaway driver, so 3 robbers and the getaway driver, end up ditching their car right outside of the Marcello family farm. Carlos's dad was a vegetable and orange grove farmer. I don't know if I said that right, but they ditched their getaway car, right outside of the house. And they end up basically setting up shop in the Marcello family home. This is a big crime. Carlos gets hauled into prison later into jail for police questioning. And their names in his father's face is like this mugshot's on the front page of the papers. But they were found not guilty. Charges were dismissed. Turns out that these bank robbers just showed up randomly and it was a coincidence. Well, a year later, Marcello himself goes to jail for basically masterminding a bank robbery or grocery store robbery in preparation for a bank robbery. He's convicted. He's sentenced to 14 years in jail. He gets a pardon, though, which is unusual. Maybe more common then, but still striking that he got a pardon from the governor. The governor at the time was O.K. Allen. O.K. Allen was known as a rubber stamp for Huey P. Long, the Kingfish. This is right before Huey's assassination in 1935. So I would assume that any pardon that was given by O.K. Allen was approved by Huey Long. Just keep that in mind. Marcello gets out of prison. He meets up with people in the criminal underworld like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. Frank Costello is trying to unload slot machines from New York. He worked out a deal with Huey Long when after LaGuardia was elected mayor, LaGuardia ran on a anti-slot machine platform. So Costello arranges a deal with Huey Long to basically export all of his slot machines from New York to New Orleans. By the time Marcello is out of prison as a young man, he opens a bar. He has a liquor store. He's also trafficking marijuana through his bar, and he also becomes somewhat involved in the pinball distribution and slot machine distribution business. He gets arrested for selling 23 pounds of marijuana to an undercover narcotics agent. He's sent to jail for a year. Believe it or not, it was only a year.
Yeah, I was going to say that's not too long at all.
Nowadays it would be, or with mandatory minimums and such. But this federal prison, after federal prison, he emerges back in New Orleans as a very respected, junior level, but still very respected person in the underworld, with connections to Costello and other people. Costello is the best person is the only real model I would say of Carlos's perspective on what organized crime meant. He always thought of himself as someone that could one day be considered legitimate. Like this was always a struggle of his, just like it was with Costello. They end up opening up some gambling clubs in Jefferson Parish with the cooperation of the sheriff. It makes national news. Estes Kefauver, senator from Tennessee, comes to New Orleans on this big tour of hearings that he has called the Kefauver hearings. They're very, very famous. It was like the first televised congressional hearings in the country. 35 million people watched this. And the one in New Orleans was the first locally televised committee hearing ever in the United States. So Carlos Marcello is the star witness. He pleads the fifth 150-something times, and they arrest him. And he becomes a celebrity. I mean, really an overnight national celebrity. Also becomes a target for deportation. So this is also part of his story is that for most of his life, the United States was trying to deport him.
Right.
And he ends up, even though he dropped out of school in the fifth grade at 14, by the way, fifth grade, 14, but
not unusual for that time period.
No. Yeah. He was, relatively an uneducated man, couldn't do simple math in his head, they say, and I think he's probably dyslexic, but at any rate, he outsmarts and outmaneuvers and outwits the United States government at every turn. He ends up taking the fortune that he made in these casinos, these sort of underground casinos, puts it in real estate, and makes an even bigger fortune, becomes very wealthy in oil and gas investments, and almost emerges as a somewhat credible businessman that's, toward the end of his life. He gets ensnared in this controversy with the governor and his staff, but it just shows you that because he has reached to the governor of Louisiana, it shows you that he was considered someone of prominence and importance, a power broker. If you talk to local prosecutors here that remember him, they'll say, yeah, he was never as much of a criminal as people thought he was nationally, but he sure was powerful in Louisiana.
Undoubtedly, if he had money.
Yeah, money. And interestingly, he had an area that the family still owns it. His son and his family still own this land. It's called Churchill Farm, which he got. That's someone that owed him $60,000 in gambling debt. Paid it off by giving him this giant spread of land that is the only undeveloped part of land in the federally protected flood zone of the greater New Orleans area. So they are sitting on some prime property.
Now, for our last segment, I really want to touch base because the reason I know about Carlos Marcello is because I read Matthew Randazzo V's book, Mr. New Orleans. Yeah. It's an excellent nonfiction book, very well written. I do recommend it, it's about Frenchy Brule, who was a Cajun guy. He was very heavily involved with the Mafia in New Orleans, and he was a buddy of Carlos Marcello, and he gives a lot of dirt. And that's how I heard about the name, because he kept popping up in the story. And a lot of people who knew Frenchy Brule said, oh, he was not a reliable narrator, through no fault of the writer. When you're a journalist, you have to trust your sources and quote them directly, and the sources may exaggerate or may like to tell a story. And Frenchy Brule liked to tell a story. So can you tell me a little bit about, because one thing Frenchy Brule accuses Carlos Marcello of is that he was behind the JFK assassination. Yeah. So is that true? Is there any credibility to that?
No, it's not true, but I could tell you that there are reasons that people think that, and they're very compelling, and I understand why I understand why people are intrigued by this. Frenchie, though, let's go back to Frenchie real quick. Frenchie's from Avoyelles Parish, which is like really close to where I grew up, and they're all Cajuns over there in Avoyelles Parish. And you're right, he's an unreliable narrator. And the author of the book, Mr. Randazzo, did a spectacular job. It's a great book. I recommend it. It's available on Kindle. I have both Kindle copy and the hardcover copy. I really like it, so I'm plugging that book. But yeah, it's full of a bunch of folklore. And it begins with the story that I know personally not to be true, which is that Frenchie and his friend, who happens to be the father of one of my good friends, growing up, they used to, the stories that he claims that they did growing up. I've literally heard this man deny to me, this has never happened. This is what story that he would always tell. It's total BS. So take it with a grain of salt. Now, and also just for what it's worth, in the FBI memos that I've been able to come across, and I think pretty much all of them are now out that you can get, that will ever be available, let's put it that way. Whatever is not out right now about Marcello will never be out. So the FBI has released everything that they have. And I haven't seen Frenchie Brulette's name come up maybe more than 6 times. And we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. So yeah, he probably and most definitely was associated with some establishment that was associated with the Marcellos. But with respect to this assassination of John F. Kennedy, I don't even know where to begin. Except let's just begin with the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans.
Right.
So naturally, right after the assassination in Dallas, all eyes focused on New Orleans. And in fact, when we see in the first memos between the field offices of Dallas and New Orleans, FBI field offices, we see right away that people in New Orleans, the bureau here, they knew exactly who this man was. He had actually just been arrested only 2 or 3 months prior for passing out flyers on Canal Street, and then he did an interview with WDSU, and was on the news. In fact, there's this great story that I forgot who tells it, but I think it was in New York Magazine about Jim Garrison, the DA at the time, having dinner with this writer, David Chandler. David Chandler was the same writer I was talking about earlier. Anyway, the DA, this is right after the arrest, Chandler says, "You should meet this guy, this young guy, Lee Harvey Oswald. He just came into the newsroom and wanted me to print an op-ed." So he was a known entity. And we just learned, by the way, that the CIA and the FBI, he had been on their radar since at least 1959. Right. He tried to defect to Russia. He was, his childhood, the records from his childhood indicate that he was a very violent, lone wolf type of kid. I mean, I hate to say it. I'm not a psychologist or someone capable of diagnosing any mental health issues, but very disturbed,
Right.
The connections between Marcello and Lee Harvey Oswald, the two men did not know one another at all. Let's be clear. The closest connection that anyone can find is that Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle, Dutz Moret, who basically was a surrogate father to Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee lost his father before he was born. Lived here in New Orleans and was a bookie at one point for a Marcello-affiliated organization. That's about as close as we can get. Jack Ruby, about a week or so before the assassination, of course, Jack Ruby being the person who killed Lee Harvey Oswald,
right?
He makes a phone call to a trailer park in New Orleans that's associated with a guy who runs the restaurant of the hotel that Carlos Marcello and his brothers own. So trailer park owned by one of his associates, Jack Ruby calls this guy. But he doesn't even talk to this guy. Jack Ruby, they say, is calling to get in touch with some showgirls that he wants to bring to the Carousel Club in Dallas. So that's another connection people try to make. There's also a claim that in 1962, Carlos Marcello drunkenly told someone that the best way to get to the best way to get to Bobby Kennedy was to get to JFK. And he said some Sicilian phrase. That's also probably not true. But there are these series of interesting anecdotes and stories. And most famously, in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was but really organized by this guy, Robert Blakey, a former staff attorney for Bobby Kennedy, law professor from Notre Dame. He wrote their final report, the committee's final report, and he in the final report claimed that Carlos Marcello, Jimmy Hoffa, and Santo Traficante were the only 3 people that the committee identified who had the motive, means, and opportunity to orchestrate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So his name is in a congressional report as being a suspect who was not ruled out.
And this is definitely at odds with Frenchie Brulet's account that Carlos Marcello worked with Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald directly, and that he ordered the hit on JFK to get back at Bobby Kennedy for having him deported. So it just goes to show the lines between legend and fact do blur over the years.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and also, it's become calcified as this truth. This is one of the reasons it bothered me inspired me in a way to write this book, is that it's an injustice to history that something that has been just clearly not true, has been repeated so often in really tabloid press and gossipy books. I don't even know how to describe what this is: crime fiction, mafia fiction, or creative nonfiction, let's say. That the real truth hasn't been remembered, and that these books now are being cited as primary source material. So no, all this is provable. And as far as his deportation is concerned, yes, the ostensible motive for Marcello having anything to do with the assassination of JFK would have been that in 1961, on April 4th, 1961, he went in for a quarterly check-in with the local INS office here in New Orleans on St. Charles Avenue, and was immediately whisked away, essentially, with only $100 in his pocket, no warning at all. Driven to Moisant International Airport and flown to Guatemala on the basis of a series of fraudulent documents, fraudulent birth certificate, and fraudulent misrepresentations that the United States made to Guatemalan officials about who he was. So he gets there, and I will tell you that in the research that I've done, I could pretty well substantiate that Bobby Kennedy did not have anything to do with actually ordering that deportation to Guatemala, and in fact was somewhat, I don't know what the right word would be, I won't say outraged, but perturbed by the way that was handled. That all of that was conducted by the outgoing commissioner of INS, a guy named Joseph Strong. Excuse me, his name escapes me now.
That's all right.
It's not Strong, but it was the outgoing commissioner of the INS at the time, and it was an Eisenhower buddy. So this is all orchestrated before. This is the very beginning of the Kennedy administration. Carlos Marcello knew, in fact, that Bobby Kennedy really could not have ordered him to go to Guatemala, but he also knew that Bobby Kennedy wanted him deported. So it makes no sense as far as motive, and I have not been able to find anything that actually substantiates even close to something I would consider a credible connection between Marcello and the assassination of Kennedy.
I mean, this is all fascinating stuff. Can you tell people what the name of your book is and where they can find it?
Yeah, the name of the book is The Original Gangster, The American Saga of Carlos Marcello. You can find it right now. I'm just going to publish an excerpt of it on my website, carlosmarcellobook.com or carlosmarcello.org. Marcello is spelled Marcello. In New Orleans, it's pronounced, that family pronounced the name Marcello. The traditional correct, quote-unquote correct pronunciation is Marcello. So just to be clear.
No problem.
The name is misspelled in so many sentences. So anyway.
Well, it sounds like fascinating stuff. You really know your stuff. So I do encourage people to go read this book and to go on your website. And we'll end on this. From terrorist groups to organized crime, we as a society should ask ourselves, how does this happen? Personal responsibility will always play a factor, but in the case of organized crime, there is always, or should always, be the question of what could have been done to prevent this crime from manifesting into a full-blown movement. For the Mafia to change the culture of an entire decade, get a president elected, allegedly get a president assassinated, build a city and run several cities, the U.S. government does have a lot of responsibility in allowing, possibly even aiding, such organized groups to have such influence in the first place. Would these groups have even existed if there wasn't such xenophobia in the first place? Do we create our own problems? Do we romanticize organized crime because they can often be better to us than our own government and history? What does this say about who is really in power? Until next time, ciao to our listeners out there.
Dancing in the moonlight on a bright night, a summer night in June, where the geese all are humming and Dixie tune, and soon you'll find them dancing